The Loss of a Loved One, written and narrated by Norma Hars.
I mind how she loved the tea ceremony, Eamon said, setting his cup back on the saucer. Nothing slipshod about Mairead. It was like a ceremony with her. Nothing to do with the need for tea, but to do with the process. Heating the pot, leaving the tea to steep exactly 7 minutes. A tiny droplet of tea hung from the coarse ginger hairs on his top lip. Would his pubic hairs be ginger too? Eileen wondered irreverently. Not that she had the least curiosity to find out. In fact, the very thought gave her the shivers. She forced her attention back to the droplet of tea and waited to see where it would deposit itself. He was actually straining the tea through his moustache. Dreadful how the loss of a loved one could cause little lapses like this. Eamon had always been meticulous about trimming his moustache. Now it resembled a straggly thatched roof. It was odd how she felt so little for him after years of thinking about nothing else and mourning the fact that he'd never had eyes for her, but only for Mairead. Now he was talking about Mairead's death as though he were the widower instead of just an unsuccessful suitor. "You should trim your moustache, Eamon." The voice didn't at all sound like hers, but like Mairead's when she was in chastisement mode. "Aren't you right?" He shook his head sadly. "Nothing seems to matter any more with her gone. But wouldn't she have been the one to remind me?" He finally looked at her with his bloodshot side eyes. "You must be missing her something fierce." I am," she reiterated. It was, after all, true. Not having Mairead around to direct and remind her of what was fitting, what was needed on the home front, was disorienting. Rose, the maid, hovered uncertainly. She'd been with them 20 years, but cut adrift from Mairead's daily instructions, she was completely lost. Eileen was no use at ordering anyone around, even someone on salary. "Do what you think, Rose." As the days wore on, it now appeared that Rose didn't think at all for herself, didn't function unless under command. At some point, something would have to be done. It was a big house to keep in order, and she never had been the neatest person. Just laying down her knitting for a few minutes had thrown Mairead into a frenzy. "In the etui, Eileen," she would order fretfully, her fancy name for the bag with the wooden handles that she'd given Eileen for her birthday. It was only now that Mairead was gone that Eileen had found out that the bag shouldn't be called an etui. According to the dictionary, etui was actually a small case for needles. Hard to believe that Mairead could have been wrong about anything. "I'm only making a cup of tea, Mairead." "Never mind, someone might drop in and get a bad impression." Mairead would have hated this. Eamon pointed a tea stain on the white cloth on the table. For that matter, the tea could have splashed off Eamon's moustache, but she refrained from mentioning that. "I'll always remember when I first noticed how beautiful she was." He stared over Eileen's shoulder, disappearing somewhere into the past. "Sparkling white she was dressed in, sparkling white. Everything about her glistened. It was the McConkey girl's wedding. I've forgotten her name now." Bridie, that was her name. Eileen had been Bridie McConkey's bridesmaid. Pale turquoise satin was what she'd worn. Her headband had been tiny pink rosebuds set in turquoise. It was lovely, that dress, full length and covered her feet, covered the built-up shoe that all her life had somehow been the biggest drawback in being able to attract and keep a boyfriend. She'd been so sure that Eamon would notice how pretty she looked. The night before the wedding, sleep had been elusive. Scenarios playing over and over again in her mind, ones that always encompassed the moment of revelation when Eamon would recognise her for what she was. Eamon smiled to himself. Little holes all over the dress, I remember that. Eyelet cotton, Eileen supplied grimly. Mairead and her jet-black curly hair, that abundant hair that made her look generous and carefree. Nobody had ever noticed that Mairead had a thin face and thin lips. Weird that they could be sisters and be packaged so completely differently. Her own hair, light brown, the colour of dried-out ditches, had never been thick. Still, the face underneath had possessed her mother's bone structure, which was generous of cheekbones and plump of mouth. "I'd never seen anything so gorgeous." He poured himself some more tea from the pot. "I had this book at home, Tales from the Knights of the Round Table. She was Guinevere stepped right out of the book." "Don't you look wonderful?" were the exact words he'd spoken to Mairead. She'd flung back her hair and given him her superior look that perfectly acknowledged the truth of his compliment. None of it had been fair. Mairead was only a guest at the wedding. She, Eileen, the bridesmaid, supposedly the resplendent one. Eamon's compliment should have been said to her. She would have blushed and known that they were fated for one another. Instead, here she was 50 years later listening to all the old rubbish over again. "I have to go, Eamon. Thank you for inviting me." She rose abruptly from the table so that her chair almost flipped over backwards. One didn't run out of a smart hotel at 70 years of age. One left unobtrusively, watching not to trip over perilous steps. She didn't look back, but fled down the street, propelled by anger. She arrived home breathless, feeling sure that the blast of her animosity must have rushed in with her and filled the whole house. Turning on the gas fire, she sat down and closed her eyes. At the same time, she felt tears spilling out of her eyes. Mairead had no business dying the way she had, just sitting down in the chair at night and closing her eyes, just like that, gone. No warning, no pains, no palpitations, no inkling that there was anything at all wrong with her. Until the very last, she'd been all business, everything planned for the following week, the meals listed and posted on the fridge. Nothing haphazard about Mairead. 2 women alone could fall into decline. It was her mantra, attention to detail, plotting one's life so that there was always purpose. What purpose now? "You will always regret it," Mairead had warned her when she came home to announce that she was going to marry Liam McCartney. "He's never had a proper job. What do you think you will live on?" Perhaps that was why she'd really accepted Liam, just to go against the family, just to say, "Here, look, I can choose for myself." What a choice she had made. Her bookkeeping job had supported both of them, but only in the most meagre style. Poor Liam, now long dead. She knew only weeks into the marriage what a mistake she'd made. Liam was the Captain Boyle of the job world, always on the brink of finding work, trotting off morning, noon and night to get his shirts starched for some supposed job offer. He'd eventually run off with a girl from the dry cleaners, which explained his obsession with clean shirts. Mairead, in her choice of a husband, had opted for money. Desmond O'Mahony had a nose for making money. It was his prime interest in life. Having fathered 2 children, his little gifts, as he always called Brendan and Jeanie, referring to them like he'd popped into Brown Thomas's to make the 2 purchases. He'd taken no further interest in them. Mairead had made up for his lack in double measure. It was no mystery why both children had chosen to live as far away from Ireland as they could manage, Brendan in Australia and Jeanie in Canada. When Desmond died strangely in a female employee's home, the story had gone around that he'd been doing some work and had had a stroke. Everyone refrained from making further inquiries, and in order to make things regular, Mairead had chosen to have the woman around to tea. Eileen had been forced to sit through the tea, as had Mairead's best friend, Marie Donnelly. "What a shock it must have been for you," Mairead clucked, handing over the blue and white cup and saucer, her best bone china, brought out to impress this female, one Siobhan Kelly, a girl wearing far too much lipstick and too little skirt. "It was dreadful, Mrs. O'Mahony. We were just going over some figures and he keeled over." Eileen choked on her tea at that point. It was all she could do to stifle what threatened to bubble over into wild laughter. The only figure that Desmond was lightly going over was Siobhan's. Desmond had always had roving hands. Once in his cups, Desmond had kissed Eileen in the kitchen, and it hadn't been at all a brotherly kiss. "Oh, such a gentleman was Mr. O'Mahony," Siobhan sighed. "He was and all." Mairead bent her head and wiped away an imaginary tear. When Liam ran off from Eileen without a by your leave or even a note, Mairead had been quick to reassure Eileen she was far better off without him. Since Liam's desertion and Desmond's death almost coincided, it had somehow evolved that Eileen moved into the big house in Ballsbridge to prevent what Mairead called rattling around on her own. Both kids had long been at boarding school, and when they did come home spent as little time as possible around the house, so the arrangement had worked. In her will, Mairead had made provision for Eileen. She was to live in the house for as long as she liked, and while she was there a certain very generous sum of money was set aside for the upkeep. It was an arrangement Eileen didn't feel at all comfortable with. She felt lonely in the big house. But when she had thoughts about selling it, the lawyer, one Finn Murphy, had advised against. Neither offspring had come home for the funeral, a fact which Eamon felt very bitter about and went on at great length about the unfeelingness of it all. "Sure, wouldn't Mairead have turned in a grave to think of the indifference?" Eamon clucked. Eileen did nothing right away after the visit to the solicitor. She returned to the big house and spent some time in Mairead's bedroom, sitting on her bed and staring out the window. Back down in the pale green and white drawing room, she viewed the bundle of her knitting as it lay by the sofa. She should, of course, have put it in the étui. She could almost hear Mairead's chiding voice. "Someone might drop in." "There's no one dropping in," she heard her own voice in reply. "One never knows." Ironic that in all the years of Mairead's concern about the possibility of people dropping in unexpectedly, no one ever had. Only Father Cromarty, whose weekly visits could hardly be called dropping in, since they were always paid more or less punctually at 4:15 on Wednesdays, when Father O'Brien was covering for him at St. Malachy's. Ostensibly he came for tea, but inevitably he chose sherry when offered. Mairead rationed herself to one Amontillado, but Eileen took the opportunity to serve herself and Father Cromarty too, sometimes 3 sherries. Mairead never knew about her intake because she was careful to take her half-full glass with her and top it up each time. "He drinks too much," Mairead always scolded when the poor man left. "What other joys can he have in life?" Eileen interjected in his support. "Priests aren't here to have joys, as you call it. They are here to pay service to God and the congregation." "That's what I mean," Eileen said blandly. Father Cromarty didn't give up his visits when Mairead was gone. In fact, he came earlier and left later, and they had a great old laugh together. There were times when Eileen wondered if the poor man didn't regret his calling. He was unlike any priest she'd ever met. Eamon was altogether a dry stick by comparison. For instance, he took in all the latest art exhibits at the National Gallery in Dublin, and just so she could discuss them with him, Eileen had taken to going to the gallery herself. Now she could barely wait for Wednesday to come around. Friday was tea with Eamon at Wynn's Hotel. These were the outings she could easily forego, but she continued with them because she felt sorry for Eamon. Each time she met him, he inquired about whether or not she had heard from Brendan or Jeanie about the house. Neither had replied to her letters, and she could only assume they were in some kind of discussion and undecided about what to do. They would be thinking that they should recompense her if they did sell, and they would not have decided on the amount. "Do you remember the wonderful party Mairead gave for Jeannie's 21st? Eamon inquired. Eileen cut into her scone and covered it liberally with strawberry jam and then a big dollop of cream. Mauve she wore, it looked wonderful with her lovely hair. Eamon, have a scone. Eileen shoved the plate towards him. Jeeves do a good job on ties, she offered, staring at the stain on his orange tie. Goodness! He looked down. Wouldn't Mairead have had a fit letting her down in a hotel of all places? Well, Mairead's not here, I am, she said tartly. Oh, right, so you are. He looked at her with a glimmer of interest. You're looking well, Eileen, he observed. Only took you bloody 50 years to notice. It was impossible to bring herself to thank him for the compliment. The following Wednesday it was a complete surprise when Eamon turned up at the house just prior to Father Cromarty's visit. I brought us a little treat, he announced, handing her a cake box. The box contained 2 meringues. Mairead would have complained about the economy of the present. Eamon's frugality had always bothered her. But that, of course, was a fact that Eamon never knew. From the Kylemore bakery, Eamon announced, pleased with himself. Father Cromarty will enjoy them, she said with the smallest hint of malice. Father Cromarty? Wednesday is Father Cromarty's day, Eamon, you remember that. He wouldn't, of course, remember. Nothing she did ever registered with him, since the sole purpose of their get-togethers was to remember all Mairead's doings, not hers. Minutes later, Father Cromarty presented himself looking jaunty and altogether unlike a priest, wearing a lovely Donegal tweed jacket, only his collar betrayed his priesthood. Take away the collar and you might have guessed he was an orchestra conductor or something just as artistic. Beside Eamon, who had developed an unhealthy-looking paunch and a yellowish pallor, he seemed brimming with vigour. Come in, Colm, come in. Weeks ago he'd insisted she drop the Father Cromarty tag, and she'd been happy to oblige. You remember our old friend Eamon O'Neill? I do, he said it soberly, and it was plain to see he was disappointed that she had company. Eamon brought us a little treat, meringues, she said later, setting down the plate, which she'd fleshed out with some chocolate biscuits. From the Kylemore bakery, Eamon said, looking smug. She handed the plate to Colm and he lifted one and set it on his plate. Eamon resisted helping himself to the remaining meringue and left it for her. Normally she would have insisted he take it, but she'd made up her mind in the kitchen she would have it herself, punishment for his spoiling her Wednesday treat. Aren't these delicious? She said after the first bite into the meringue. There was no hiding Eamon's disappointment. After a number of brave attempts to bring up Mairead's name, he gave up introducing her into the conversation. Neither she nor Colm picked up the ball, and after his second cup of tea he got up and announced that he had to leave. There was nothing for him there, not the sustenance he had expected. I'll see you Friday, Eileen. Don't bother to come to the door, I can see myself out. My knee is a little achy, Eamon, so I'll let you do that. Yet another disappointment, for despite his protestations he'd assumed that she would accompany him to the door. Right. See you Friday. With Eamon gone, the stiffness in the atmosphere departed with him. Eileen got up briskly enough, lifting the tea tray, carrying it into the kitchen. Coming back, she went to the dining room and brought the tray with the 2 sherry glasses and a bottle of sherry. Without asking, she poured 2 sherries and handed one to Colm. I'm sorry about that. He came unexpectedly. Oh, that's fine. He still carries the torch for Mairead, I notice. Yes. Sad to be hopelessly in love for 50-odd years with no acknowledgement. Eileen frowned into her glass, tasting a sudden bitterness. You must miss her too. I'm sorry she died, but I have a confession. I enjoy your company more than I ever did Mairead's." She felt her face flush. If he'd finished the sherry, she might have guessed it was the drink talking, but he'd only had the merest sip. Mairead always said people got foolish with drink taken. I felt like a right lump on Wednesdays. Her conversation seemed to shine by comparison. "You thought so?" "Yes. Didn't you?" "I can remember wishing she would talk less and you more." Unbelievable embarrassment flooded through her. Such talk in Mairead's house seemed almost sacrilegious. The following Wednesday she was almost glad they weren't alone. Brendan had come all the way from Australia and was staying in the house. He was unrecognisable from the Brendan who had left 10 years before. He was very tan and sleek with an earring in his ear, and his hair, which at one time had been brown, was blonde. Perhaps that's what Australia did to the hair, but she suspected a bit of the bleach bottle had helped it along. On Wednesday, Colm greeted Brendan warmly, and she was glad that there was no lingering ill feeling about Brendan's missing his mother's funeral, unlike Eamon, who came over to the house with barely disguised ill feelings about Brendan's shabby treatment over Mairead's death. "The prodigal returns," he said somewhat sourly. "How are you, Eamon? Well, I hope." "I've been better, Eamon said grimly. "It's very hard with your mother gone," he said pointedly. "Wasn't she a great anchor in my life?" It was an unfortunate choice of words, and Brendan could barely suppress the tiny twitch at the corner of his lips. It seemed everyone had known of Eamon's unrequited longing. "Life goes on, Eamon," he broke in quickly. Yes, for some. Eamon was not to be put off. After he had left, Brendan heaved a sigh of relief. "What a dreary drink of water he is. How did Mother ever stand him?" Despite what she might think about Eamon now, Eileen felt irritation with Brendan. "Eamon wasn't always like that," she defended him. "Wasn't he? I can't remember him any other way, sort of handmaiden to Mother's whims, as was everyone else around. It's amusing to see Father Cromarty still coming and all the deferential stuff still going on." She held her tongue. She could hardly tell him about her and Colm's shared interest in art. After a week of pussyfooting around, he finally spat out the reason for his visit. "You seem to be rattling around here." Yes, indeed I am. Jeannie and I have been talking, and we realised that Mother's will was quite specific. You were to be looked after." "I have my own nest egg and pension. I don't need charity," Eileen said staunchly. She didn't add that neither would go far in today's Dublin. "Of course you have, but Jeannie and I have decided that we would like to buy you a little flat." He didn't get any further before she burst in. I couldn't accept that." "Then, of course, you must stay in the house." She was in a sudden dilemma. Was it fair to deprive both him and Jeannie of what would be a rich return from the sale of the house? Her stubbornness would obviously do that. Perhaps the thing was to swallow her pride and accept their offer. Otherwise it would turn into a horrible stalemate. "You like this house?" he asked her. "It's all right." He looked around with a kind of distaste. "I never liked it here. It always seemed lifeless, a bit like a museum." "There are lovely things here, Brendan. Your mother had the best of taste." "Yes, no one can deny that," he said briskly enough. "So, what have you decided?" "I suppose it would be unfair of me to stay." "Right, that's decided then," he said briskly. After putting the sale of the house in the hands of a reliable estate agent, Brendan left a week later. They didn't have to worry unduly about keeping the house ship-shape. It sold within a week of being listed and for the full, and what Eileen considered exorbitant asking price. The only person incredibly upset about the whole thing was Eamon. He bleated on endlessly about the sale of the house and the loss of memories. That Brendan and his dyed hair and earring, what is that supposed to be anyway? Neither fish nor fowl. Wouldn't Mairead have had 40 fits if she'd seen him? Mairead's dead and gone, Eamon, and it's time you realised that. She surprised herself how sharp she sounded. Eamon looked momentarily wounded, but soon returned to his usual form. He appeared not too upset by her chastisement. Eamon put himself in his car at her disposal to drive her around to see all manner of flats that were for sale in Dublin. She let nothing interfere with her Wednesdays with Colm. "We're both changing our lifestyles," Colm told her a few weeks later. "How so, Colm?" "I'm retiring." Eileen was aghast. She'd never thought about priests retiring, but of course it had to be so. Still, some of them seemed so ancient by comparison with Colm. She wondered for a moment if he had some kind of illness that he hadn't told her about. "Are you all right, Colm?" "Never better." She was puzzled. "So, why don't you just carry on?" "I have no heart for it any more." "You're not leaving the church?" "In a manner of speaking. They offered to send me to Kildare to a sort of retirement home for priests. It's close to where I was born." A kind of cold descended on Eileen at the thought of losing his company. She turned her head away and poured him his regular glass of sherry. "And you're going?" "No, I'm not, as it happens. I put some money by and I prefer to be independent. Sure, I've no one to leave the money to, and I might as well have my own life now. Which brings me to something I've been thinking about for some time, Eileen." He stretched out his hand and accepted his glass of sherry and peered seriously into the depths of the glass. "Since we're both more or less cast out, as it were, would it offend you if I suggested we might find a place together, all strictly above board, as friends, if that's how you would like it?" She duly noted the pause after the friends bit, and she felt her face flush again. There was no describing the kinds of emotion that she was feeling. "We have so much in common, and there really is no one else I would rather be with." She put up her hand. "Please, Father Cromarty." She blushed again at the retreat back to the formal address. "Please, I would like time to think about all this." "Oh, naturally, I said it all too fast. I apologise." No, don't apologise." He got up abruptly. "I should have given you more time. I'm sorry." When he was gone, she paced through the house. Confusion was her chief emotion. She could hear Mairead's voice plainly. Set up house with a priest. Imagine the talk. Then who was there to talk? Her life was relatively simple. The few friends she had weren't the judgmental sort, and even if they had been, why should she listen or care? She visualised Eamon's reaction. "He's taking advantage of you, Eileen." It wasn't that the thought hadn't crossed her own mind. What if Colm had no taste for communal life and merely wanted to break away? Still, he had talked about having some money of his own. He would not be living off her if she did decide to accept his offer. In a way, wouldn't she be using him? Friday, at Wynn's, Eamon looked remarkably smart for a change. No tea stains on his tie, and it appeared he had bought himself a new sports jacket. It wouldn't have been her choice for him, but at least it wasn't the ratty old number he usually wore. "I thought we'd have the full afternoon tea today," he announced as the waitress came with a loaded trolley of goodies. "What's the occasion, Eamon?" "I have a little proposition, Eileen." He ran a finger along the inside of his collar as though he was feeling choked. The waitress set their cups in front of them and fussed around with the milk and sugar. Before the proposition was even out of his mouth, she'd already guessed what it would be. To think that she'd waited some 50-odd years to hear the wished-for words. Now that they were out there, she felt absolutely nothing. None of the places you've been looking at are practical in any way, Eileen, and now that I have no more lodgers, the house is much too big for me." He paused and looked embarrassed. "You want me to move in as a lodger, Eamon?" she said ingenuously, determined not to help him out. "Not at all, not at all. You'd think I'd take rent from you." "No, Eileen, I was thinking of altogether a different proposition." She handed him his cup filled with tea. He stared into it and chewed on his lip, obviously uncertain whether to go on or not. "Yes," she said brightly. "Well, I was thinking we should tie the knot, Eileen." With the words actually spoken, he looked visibly relieved. What a weird term tying the knot was. It could as well be noose instead of knot. Definitely in this case it would be. She could imagine spending the rest of her days in Eamon's company, discussing every event that Mairead had ever hosted, or any party where Mairead and Eamon had been included as guests. She poured her own tea slowly, savouring the fact that Eamon was actually completely focused on her for a change. Why give him his answer now? After all, he kept her waiting 50 years. She was entitled to a little latitude. As a rule, she ate very little of the repast supplied by the hotel, but for some reason today she felt ravenous. She tucked in voraciously, and Eamon watched her with a sort of wonder. "These things can't be decided overnight, Eamon," she said solemnly. "Oh, naturally not," he agreed. "You were always a thoughtful woman, Eileen." She refused the lift home from Eamon and told him instead that she had a little shopping to do. He left her reluctantly, but actually refrained from asking her when he would have his answer. She took off down the street with a new, jaunty step. Turning into O'Connell Street, for a change she didn't avoid her reflection in the shop windows, but looked at the woman with the built-up shoe. She was barely aware of the grin on her face, but the people were looking at her strangely as she passed. She stopped off on the way home at the fishmonger's and bought several scoops of prawns. Tonight she would treat herself, for after all, wasn't she well worth it? How many other 70-year-old women had been the recipient of 2 proposals in 1 week? Hadn't her mother always told her that she would come into her own one day? She had only failed to say when that would be, and some years back Eileen had more or less given up hope that it would ever happen. She smiled again to herself and sniffed the package of prawns appreciatively as she waited for the bus that would take her home. Life, after all, was good, and, if she made the right choices, was about to get better.